Mr. Moulton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for giving me some time since Mr. Mast would not to address some of these specific concerns. Let me just start by acknowledging my colleagues from California, both Mr. Lamalfa and Ms. Steele, for pointing out that this project has been mismanaged in the past. I conducted an extensive financial analysis of the California high-speed rail project a decade ago. And indeed, that was my conclusion. In fact, we concluded that the project was probably going to cost about twice as much as they were saying, if not more. But here's the key thing. Here's the key point. It will still cost a lot less than the alternatives. In California, the single high-speed rail line being built between San Francisco and LA to eventually connect both of those cities offers the capacity of 6 new highway lanes, 91 airport gates, and 2 new runways at roughly half the base cost of these alternatives. So I acknowledge the cost overruns. I acknowledge the mismanagement in the past. That is not the case today. It is very much the case today that this is a better use of taxpayer money than the alternatives. And anyone who's been to California, as I'm sure my colleagues from California know, recognize that transportation demand is growing. Traffic is out of control. People want alternatives. The idea that we can solve this by building more highway lanes, taking way more private land than the high-speed rail line will take, or that we can solve this by simply expanding airports where there's no land to expand them at all, is simply a fallacy. Now, my colleague from Florida, although he wouldn't yield me time, noted that he has a problem with the Brightline project, suggesting that they might need some federal subsidies. But it's interesting that there's no issue with giving federal money to roads, no issue with giving federal money to the airlines through the TSA, air traffic control, or building airports. We have this crazy standard for high-speed rail that it should be entirely supported by the private sector when none of its competition is at all. In fact, if you really look at the cost of roads, you have to figure in the cost of emergency vehicles, state police, literally the cost of the tens of thousands of deaths that occur on our highways every year if you want to understand the full cost of that mode of transportation. Now, Mr. Lamalfa is also concerned about the ticket prices. One thing to understand about high-speed trains is that selling an additional seat does not cost any more in fuel. This is very different than airline pricing. What that means is that you can sell tickets on a train for $300, but the last seats on that train can go for $10, which you can't do on a plane. You can't drive between LA and San Francisco for $10. But to fill a train at no additional incremental cost, you'll take whatever incremental revenue you can get. So in economic terms, that means that you can have a train that people riding in first class may pay $300. They may even pay more, as they do for first class on the Acela. But everybody else can afford the cheaper tickets on the train. Now, this is also not just about what we can use today, because look, I acknowledge this project is also taking longer than it was originally planned for, but it's about the capacity we have in 2050. I already mentioned that building this high-speed rail line costs half the price of the alternatives, but that's just to meet 2050 travel demand. Once you get to 2050, you can still add more trains to the high-speed rail line, whereas you're maxed out on the other modes. So if we're just building highways, then after building those 6 lanes, we've got to build more. After building those 2 runways, we've got to build more. The high-speed rail line will not take any more land. So for our grandkids who are worried about giving up private land in 2050, not just the land we're worried about giving up today, high-speed rail is also the better alternative. Now, I don't need to tell you that this is the better alternative for our climate. You literally plug in a high-speed rail line to a renewable energy source, and you have a completely carbon-free transportation system. But because trains also come right to downtown and inspire the kind of sustainable, walkable developments that don't need to be forced through zoning, but are simply the result of transit-oriented development around high-speed rail stations, you also have more sustainable communities that don't require vast parking lots for all those cars that come into a city when everyone has to drive between LA and San Francisco, or drive from LAX to other parts of the city, or drive from SFO into downtown. So there are myriad accessory benefits to having high-speed rail. And at the end of the day, There's a reason why countries like Morocco, with a 0.5% of our GDP, are investing in 200-mile-per-hour trains. They don't have money to waste. You get a better return on your investment. American taxpayers deserve that too.